Hello everyone. Welcome to class. Welcome to this online video version of our class. I hope that this mini recorded talk finds you all well. I just want to offer some notes for this week. I thought that it might be nice to post something that is just audio and visual instead of just continuing to type up the notes like I have been. I know that sometimes it's easier just to kind of take in information this way, so we'll give it a try and see how it goes. So for this week, we are moving away from the media literacy unit. We closed that out this past weekend with Essay 3. That's what we have been working on the past 3 weeks since spring break. And we are moving into our penultimate section, our second to last section for this semester, which is on false binaries for your microtheme 5. So what I would like to talk about in this video are 3 things. 2 different kinds of logical fallacies, the appeal to tradition and false binaries, and then I want to briefly discuss Us and Them by David Sedaris, which is one of the 2 things that you are asked to read this week. Both of those readings, by the way, can be found on Blackboard, so those are not in your textbook. And your syllabus does state that, but just to clarify that. So let's begin let's begin with a reminder about what logical fallacies are. So we were talking about logical fallacies before spring break, but that does seem like quite a few weeks ago by this point. So a lot has obviously happened since then. Sorry, my dog is snoring over there. I don't know if you can hear her or not, but logical fallacies are errors in reasoning. That would be a kind of brief and simple definition of that, and you all should have in your notes, I don't know if your notebooks are with you or not, but you all should have in your notes a list of logical fallacies that we had begun discussing and talking about in class previously. So if you do have those notes, you can open those up and add these 2 new ones to that list as well. And by the way, in English 102, that class is focused on research and argument. So we are trying to lay some groundwork to give you all kind of a leg up in that class. That, of course, is a required class that all of you will be required to take no matter what your major is after you pass English 101, the class that we're doing now. So again, let's begin with appeal to tradition. So this we see both in Shirley Jackson's The Lottery, which is one of your 2 readings for this week. You likely noticed parallels between Shirley Jackson's The Lottery and the Parks and Rec episode that you were asked to watch for your Essay 2 evaluation. So in that Parks and Rec episode, there were some old, outdated rules that were not only not benefiting people, but actually were they were outdated, they were racist, they were misogynistic, they were throwing somebody named Ted into the lake every year and ruining his cell phone just because the charter had misspelled T, right? They misspelled it as Ted. So basically what they discovered in that episode, of course it was comedy, but what they discovered was that yes, some rules are outdated and we should change them. Shirley Jackson's short story is not comedy, but it does have the same kind of theme, the same kind of idea, and the same kind of message, although it comes at it from a very different perspective. It is more dark, it is more morbid, and by the way, spoiler alerts on that, so I'm kind of assuming that you have already read that before you're listening to this talk. It's okay if you haven't, but just know I'm going to talk about what happens in it, so if you're the kind of person who doesn't like to know what is about to happen when you're reading a short story, maybe just stop this video and read that reading first. And then return to this. So in Shirley Jackson's The Lottery, obviously you can tell by the title that the lottery is the kind of important focus of this short story. Well, the lottery is usually something good, right? Usually if you win the lottery, that means you won something, usually money, hopefully a lot of money, right? It's a cause of celebration. Yay, I won the lottery. In this case, though, in Shirley Jackson's The Lottery is actually a negative thing. You do not want to win the lottery. And just kind of, in a nutshell, what happens is that all of the community members in this small town and all of the other towns around them do the same thing. But all of the community members come together and they put in everybody's name into this box, and then they draw one name every year in June. They do this. And whoever's name is drawn, they stone that person to death. So in this case, obviously, winning the lottery is not really in your own best interest. It doesn't really benefit you. It is the worst kind of lottery ever, actually, right? If you think about it. So, in Shirley Jackson's The Lottery, why do they do this? That's a great question. I think that's an important question to ask, and very little is actually said to answer that in the text itself. So there is this kind of saying of lottery in June, corn be heavy soon, or something to that effect. So there's this kind of like superstitious old notion that like if we do this thing once a year, then the corn is going to produce well for us and we'll have a great harvest and we will continue to be successful and to have the things that we need to survive. So before spring break, we talked about how correlation does not equal causation. That's another kind of logical fallacy. We talked about how two things can actually have one cause. For example, there is this thing and it's causing these two things to happen separately. Or maybe we think that this thing is causing this thing, but actually this thing is causing this way, right? So which direction is the cause and effect actually flowing? These are important questions for us to ask when we are noticing cause and effect, to not just make assumptions of like, oh, this thing causes this thing, because actually it might not be that simple, right? So basically the townspeople are making that mistake when they are relying on the lottery for a good harvest, right? Maybe last year they had the lottery and last year they also have a good harvest, but does that mean that the reason they had a good harvest was because they stoned one of their members to death? Of course not, right? So it's kind of a warning, a very ominous warning in this story, and the kind of takeaway message from it would be that we should not do things simply because that is what we have always done, right? And so that is exactly what the appeal to tradition is about. So again, the appeal to tradition, you can write that in your notes if you want to. It is another kind of logical fallacy, and it is an error in reasoning that basically says we should do this thing because it's what we've always done. That is a terrible reason to keep doing something, right? Especially something that there is negative repercussions of. So, for example, if maybe there's a tradition, everybody in your family always eats pizza on Tuesdays, and everyone really enjoys Tuesdays because they really enjoy eating pizza together as a community. Great. That sounds like a fantastic, harmless tradition to have, right? I don't think that we would need to look into that one too closely, examine it too much, or worry about it too much, right? It's just something that people have always done. They enjoy it. Great. They'll continue to do it. However, especially with transitions that are causing harm to an individual, to a group of people, to a society, whatever, it's important to look at those traditions and ask ourselves, like, are there positive outcomes of this that are making it worth the negative drawbacks, whatever those may be, right? So in this case, getting together and stoning someone to death, is that bringing about something that is so good that this bad thing is worth it? Of course not, right? Of course it's not. But I think an important note here is that the appeal to tradition doesn't necessarily mean that all traditions are bad. It just means that we should examine them, right? So it's not saying that we shouldn't have traditions, and it's not saying that we shouldn't do something that we enjoy doing or that is actually helping us in some way. It's just saying that things are not necessarily good because they're a tradition. They're not necessarily bad because they're a tradition. That's not a reason to do something in and of itself, right? So that is the appeal to traditions in Shirley Jackson's The Lottery. And I think that's all that I have to say about that one for now. But more significantly, let's move on now to the false binaries. This one is, of course, more significant because it is what you'll be focusing on for your next homework assignment, Microtheme 5. So false binaries, they're also called the either-or fallacy. And again, if you are taking notes, if you have your notebook with you, you could write that one in as well. So false binaries or either-or fallacy. What is a false binary? Well, let's go ahead and break down the etymology of that word. So look at its root words. Binary, bi, right? Bi means two. So bicycle, 2 wheels. Unicycle, 1 wheel. Tricycle, 3 wheels. Bicycle, 2 wheels. Also, binary numbers. If any of you are familiar with computer programming or something like that, you might be familiar with binary numbers, 0 and 1, and how that pattern repeats in all of these different ways to create its own kind of language, right? So a false binary, if bi means 2, and if a binary is 2, then a false binary, as you might suspect, is basically being given only 2 choices as if they are all of the choices when actually they're not. So another way of saying that would be a false binary basically oversimplifies, it waters down a conversation, a topic that is really quite spacious and complex. It only offers 2 options when in fact there are many. Oftentimes, it will look at the 2 extremes and make less of everything that's in between them. So actually, something is on a spectrum, but it's like we're only going to mention the 2 things on the far ends here. So let me give you some specific examples to make this a little bit more tangible. If I had a board, I would write this on the board right now, but I don't, so I won't. But let's see, once you start to recognize them, you really will start to see them all around you, whether that is in advertising or in arguments that other people make, that kind of thing. Because we really are we're swimming in them. Our culture is very saturated in binaries and in false binaries. By the way, not anytime you see an either or, it isn't necessarily a false binary. Just like how the appeal to tradition, not all traditions are necessarily bad, not all binaries are inherently false, although many of them will be. So here's an example. Good and evil. That's one that we see a lot, right? So again, it's the extremes. It's all good and all evil, and it kind of doesn't leave room for the middle ground, for the more complicated ways of existing. I'm thinking in particular about like movie characters when I'm thinking about good and evil in this conversation. So thinking about maybe like superhero movies, and it's just the good guys versus the bad guys, right? This person is all good and this person is all bad, that kind of thing. I am by no means an expert on superhero movies, but it seems to me that superhero movies and movies in general and TV shows in general seem to be kind of following this trend of characters becoming more complex. I think that American audiences are kind of asking for more complex characters. Like, I'm just thinking about, what is that Disney movie? I watched it as a very young child, Sleeping Beauty. So Sleeping Beauty, right? My at least very hazy recollection of it is that there's this witch who's all bad who curses Aurora, Sleeping Beauty, something like that. Again, it's been so long since I've seen that, but all that matters is that the characters they're very simple and you don't question them, right? This character is just all good just because they are, right? This character is just all bad just because they are, and that's all there is to it, and you don't question it. There's no further motivation, and that's just how things are. But there's this remake, a more recent remake that you might be, well, it's not a remake actually, it's just a retelling of the story from a different perspective that you perhaps might be familiar with, Maleficent with Angelina Jolie in it, and it tells the story from a different perspective, right? From the perspective of that so-called wicked witch. Very similarly, The Wizard of Oz, right? You have this bad witch who's just all bad, no reason, she's just bad, she's a bad person, there's nothing to question. There's nothing more to see here. She's just a bad witch. And then we've got, I think her name is maybe Glenda, if I'm not mistaken, who's just the good witch, right? She's just good. No reason why, at least not that I can remember. It's been a while since I have seen Wizard of Oz as well. But there's a remake of that one as well. It's not like a straight remake, but it's kind of a retelling of that story. And of course, Wicked, right, is the one that I'm thinking of here. So that musical that kind of retells that story, but from the perspective of the Wicked Witch in The Wizard of Oz. And we find out that actually, like Maleficent, she too is actually not that wicked a person. They're actually responding to things in a very understandable way, but we just didn't really have the whole story before, right? So basically, a binary like a binary trope in movies, and we see it a lot in superhero movies, all good, all evil, whenever actually things could be made into a spectrum. They could seem to be a lot more complicated, right? Maybe this character is good, but they also have this really tragic flaw. I think that makes the story more interesting. It makes characters more realistic, more complex. Maybe this character is all bad, but maybe it's because they're like super traumatized because of something that happened, right? Maybe actually if you knew more about this character, their stance would be kind of understandable in a certain way, that kind of thing. So some more examples of false binaries would be strong and weak, rich and poor, short and tall, fat and thin, and so on. You hopefully are getting the idea here. So notice that with all of these, they isolate the extremes and act as if there's no middle ground. And the thing is, it becomes kind of ridiculous once you start to really think about it and look more deeply into it. So for example, rich and poor. So this kind of if these are the only two options, then there is like a certain point where like if you had $1 more or a cent more, you would go from being poor to being rich, right? Which is ridiculous. Like those are the extremes. And yet if these are the only two extremes that we have to choose from, then it's like, okay, if you have $10, you're poor, but if you have $12 and you're rich. Well, what if you have $11.99? You're not quite rich, you're just poor, right? Hopefully you get the idea with that. Also, strong and weak. So what if I can arm wrestle with the Incredible Hulk and win? I think I'm pretty strong if I can do that, right? But then maybe let's say that Batman is even stronger than the Incredible Hulk. And then I arm wrestle with Batman and I lose. Does that make me now strong or weak? Well, compared to the Incredible Hulk, I am strong, but compared to Batman, I am weak, right? So you see how it kind of like depends on in comparison to what, right? The same thing with like small and large. So like we as humans, are we small or are we large? Well, compared to an ant, we are humongous. Compared to the galaxy or like the solar system, we are very small, right? So some of these, it's like, well, in compared to what? Like from what perspective or what vantage point are we looking at this situation from? Great. So hopefully that's all clear and making sense so far. So how do we disprove a false binary? If we encounter this in an argument, simply offer a third option. It's actually very simple. So for example, if someone offers the false binary of rich or poor, we could point to, well, what about the middle class, right? What about someone who isn't necessarily either but falls in between those things? Or we could kind of complicate the idea of wealth or the idea of poverty, right? And say like, well, what about like someone who is really wealthy in terms of having a lot of money, but they are unhappy and lonely and they have no friends and no family and all they do is work and they hate their life? Is that person, materialistically, yes, they're wealthy, but in another way, maybe they have some kind of like social or emotional poverty. For your next homework assignment, microtheme 5, and do make sure that you take a close look at that prompt and rubric that I've posted. You are being asked to locate binaries in one of the selected readings and to break them down by asking questions about these binaries and showing how it's actually more complicated than how that binary is presented. I'm going to give an example. Well, actually, I wrote out an entire example, so definitely check that out as well. So I actually did your microtheme 5 homework, and I did it for this reading, which is not one of your options for your homework. So you just have a couple of readings that we have already done together, and you're being asked to choose a set of binaries and then follow through all of the questions that are being asked about them. So I went through and I answered all of the questions and just kind of did a mock homework assignment as a sample for you. But again, I did it with us and them. So we'll go ahead and talk about us and them now. Actually, maybe I will end this video and do a part 2 to discuss us and them, just to make sure the audio is working and all of that kind of thing. So hopefully hopefully this will be one of 2.